The world is at a historic crossroads, marked by significant shifts in global power relations, intensification of geopolitical tensions, paralysis in international cooperation, impact of the socio-economic and international relations fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, the increase in the number and brutality of conflicts, the explosion of the climate change emergency, the persistence of the cost of living and debt crisis. This all highlights both the flaws and increasing inadequacy, if not failure, of the prevailing global order. The intersecting crises have brought the multilateral system to the brink. While some strongly support a transformative reform of the multilateral system, others are disposed to incremental reform to the world order that emerged after the Second World War. Notably, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, have voiced support for the reform of the multilateral system by stating that international institutions are no longer fit for purpose.
My central message is clear. We are in an unprecedented situation and the normal rules no longer apply. We cannot resort to the usual tools in such unusual times. The creativity of the response must match the unique nature of the crisis, and the magnitude of the response must match its scale.
This is Amani Africa Dispatch, our videocast on current political, governance, and peace and security affairs of continental and multilateral policy importance. The UN Secretary-General's Our Common Agenda, prompted by the request made during the UN's 75th anniversary, proposed convening the Summit of the Future to take steps toward the solidarity and the renewal of the multilateral system.
Multilateral institutions have proven too weak and fragmented for today's global challenges and risks. As a result, we risk a failure of serious instability and climate chaos. Last year, in the Leaders' Declaration marking the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, you charged me with providing recommendations to advance our common agenda.
The UN Secretary-General released 10 policy briefs in 2023 to provide framing analysis to UN member states as they negotiate the Pact for the Future, scheduled for adoption at the upcoming Summit of the Future in September 2024. The draft Pact for the Future indicates that it's clear from member states and stakeholders' inputs that reform of the Security Council remains a priority for the Summit of the Future. A key component of this reform is redressing the historical injustice of Africa's non-representation and the category of permanent membership of the UN Security Council. Another key reform agenda in the draft Pact for the Future is the reform of the international financial architecture. In his address to the UN General Assembly on 6 February 2024, Guterres restated the view that today's financial architecture is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. He went on to note that it favors rich countries that designed it nearly 80 years ago. Developing countries that Africa is a part of remain without representation in the decision-making structures of the international financial institutions. The bias of these institutions to major shareholding countries and creditors had rendered them extractive towards developing countries, prompting Guterres to call the term of borrowing by developing countries extortionist.
The global financial architecture is outdated, dysfunctional, and unjust. It has failed in its basic function as a global safety net, and so it needs deep structural reform.
African countries pay interest rates that are on average at least 8 times higher than developed countries for borrowing. The statistics reveal a concerning trend, with Africa projected to spend approximately $74 billion on debt service in 2024, in many instances leaving countries with little money to invest in productive sectors and social services. It has gotten to a point where the debt crisis issue is diverting focus from important discussions on development financing. Zainab Usman, the director of Carnegie Africa program, also raised this concern by stating that we are no longer talking about investments in physical infrastructure and social services, but debt servicing. The concern that she expressed was based on the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development data, which indicates that around 3.3 billion people in the world reside in countries where the amount of money spent on debt interest payments exceeds the disbursement on education and health. Another example that illustrates how the financial system is skewed against the needs of developing countries, most of which in Africa, is allocation of the IMF special drawing rights. Africa receives only 5% of the special drawing rights allocation. Instead of those who need it the most, it's those with the highest quota and needed the least that were allocated the lion's share of the special drawing rights. In the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, the global cost of living crisis, and the debt crisis facing mostly African countries is a major setback that the people in Africa have faced relating to the fight against poverty. Instead of decreasing, the poverty rate is rising for the first time in decades. According to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the outbreak of the COVID-19 has pushed tens of millions of people into extreme poverty. The situation has deteriorated further, reversing the progress towards meeting the Agenda 2030 of Sustainable Development Goals in poverty reduction and other indices.
Today, only 15% of the targets are on track, and many are going in reverse.
These setbacks highlight the need for both the Secretary General's proposed stimulus package and the reform of the global economic, trade, and financial systems, structure, and business model. Unlike the post-Second World War period, where most African countries were either under colonial rule or in the process of gaining independence, African countries now have the opportunity to actively participate in negotiations for such reforms. The Summit of the Future provides African member states with a unique platform to contribute to the policy process for the reform of the multilateral system. Given the African Union's role as a forum for member states to collectively address challenges and shape the continent's future, the upcoming 37th AU Summit should serve as a launching pad for formulating a common African position on the issues of the Summit of the Future's agenda. This would not be the first time that Africa takes a collective strategic position in the face of global changes. In 1990, the Organization of African Unity adopted a declaration on Africa's political and socio-economic situation in Africa and the changing global landscape. This served as a roadmap for positioning Africa in the changing global order. Today, the world is at another more consequential crossroad. The weight of the current developments thus necessitates the AU to have a debate during its summit similar to the 1990 OAU summit that adopted the OAU Declaration on the political and socio-economic situation in Africa and the fundamental changes taking place in the world. This is Amani Africa Dispatch.